Hey, how's it going, guys? Welcome back to a brand new video. In today's video, I want to talk a little bit more about the interstate system, what it is, the history of it, and just some random facts about the interstate system. Before we get into it though, like and subscribe so that you never miss an upload. So what is the interstate system? Well, in the United States, the interstate system is a system of controlled access freeways, which allows people to travel at higher speeds because there's no traffic lights on the freeways. There's a ton of different standards that we could go into for the interstate system, but for this video, I'll spare you the details. Basically, the interstate highway system is meant for people to go at high speeds without stoplights. So now let's get into a little bit of the history of the interstate system. The interstate system was first thought by Dwight Eisenhower, and he had a few road-related experiences in his life that helped him develop this concept. First of all, as a young man in the Army, he took a trip across America in 1919 with a Corps of Engineers, and it took him about 3 months to get across the country. And also, as Supreme Allied Commander in World War II, he went to Germany and saw their efficient Autobahn system and applied that system to America. So the Interstate Highway Act was first passed in 1956, and later that year, the first 8-mile segment of freeway I-70 west of Topeka, Kansas was officially opened. And it took almost 40 years for the entire original system of interstate highways to be completed. And what's funny is the last segment of interstate highway to be completed was also an I-70, just one state over in Colorado. There's a very specific part of the interstate that went through a mountain pass that required a ton of engineering to complete. But in 1992, the original highway system was completed, although there are still new interstates being built today, such as I-42 in North Carolina. Now let's get into how the interstate highway system actually works. There are two types of interstate highways. First of all, there's highways that run north to south, and then there's highways that run east to west. So north to south highways end in odd numbers, and east to west highways end in even numbers. And in general, the major north-south routes in the country end in 5, and the major east-west routes in the country end in 0. Now that's a term that you want to get used to when you talk about interstates in general, because there's a lot of rules that apply to the interstate system that have a lot of exceptions. However, the interstate system always follows this one rule, which is that for north-south interstates, the mileage increases as you go from the southern part of the interstate, whether that's at the border or at the southern terminus of it in a city. It increases from that point, and it goes up as you get closer to the northern border. And for east-west interstates, the same is true, but instead it just increases from the western part of the interstate or the western border of that state. Also, in general, the exit numbers on the interstate are the same as the mile marker, although in some areas of the country, like upper New England for example, this isn't always the case. Now let's talk a little bit more about the major interstates. So first of all, start with the north-south ones. The numbers increase as you go from west to east. So the first interstate we're going to talk about is I-5. This one is a major north-south route starting at the Mexican border and going all the way to the Canadian border along the west coast. Next up, you have I-15. It starts in San Diego, but it takes a turn east to go up to Las Vegas, Salt Lake City, and the Canadian border, Montana. Then we have I-25, starting in New Mexico outside of El Paso, going up through the Denver area, and then ending in Wyoming after Cheyenne and Casper. And then we have I-35, starting in Laredo, Texas, going up to Dallas-Fort Worth, and then going up through areas like Kansas City and Des Moines, Minneapolis, before ending in Duluth. Then we have our first exception to the rule, which is I-45. I-45 is a Texas-only interstate, which goes from Galveston to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Then we have I-55. It's normal again. It goes from New Orleans up to Chicago. I-65, same kind of deal. Starts in Mobile, goes up to cities like Nashville, Indianapolis, before ending in Gary, which is basically connecting you to Chicago. Then we have I-75, starting in the Miami area, going up through Atlanta, going up through Knoxville, going up through Lexington, Kentucky, Ohio, and then going up to Detroit, before ending in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan at the Canadian border. Then we have our second exception, I-85. It's not as bad as 45, but it doesn't go cross country. Instead, it starts in Montgomery, Alabama, going up through Atlanta, my hometown, Spartanburg, Charlotte, Durham, and then ending outside of Richmond, Virginia. And then I-95 is the longest north-south interstate, as you guys have seen my short. It goes up through Florida, Georgia, Carolinas, Virginia, and then the Northeast. So Baltimore, Philly, New York, Boston, and it ends in Maine at the Canadian border. Now let's talk a little bit more about the major east-west routes. So the major east-west routes, they increase as you go north. So starting with I-10, it starts in Santa Monica, California, and it goes all the way across the southern United States through states like Arizona, Texas, Louisiana, and it ends in Jacksonville, Florida. I-20 is sort of an exception as well. It doesn't fully go cross country, but it starts in West Texas, going up to places like Abilene, Dallas, Fort Worth. Then it just goes across the deep south before going through Atlanta, and then it ends in South Carolina, not in Myrtle Beach, but in Florence, unfortunately. Then we have the big exception of these interstates, which is I-30. Although it's numbered like a major east-west route, it's not one. It starts in Fort Worth after branching off from I-20, and then it goes through the metro area, and then it connects Texarkana to Little Rock, where it ends at I-40, which is the next interstate. So I-40 starts in Barstow, California, going all the way through areas like northern Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma City, before going through Arkansas, Memphis, Nashville. Then go through the mountains of Tennessee and North Carolina before going to Raleigh and finally ending in Wilmington. I-50 and I-60 were skipped because those were existing U.S. highways that were major U.S. highways. So we pick back up with I-70, which is also one that doesn't go completely across the country. It starts in Utah, branching off from I-15, and then it goes through Denver, Kansas. It goes through Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and it ends in Baltimore, Maryland. Then I-80 starts in San Francisco. Then it goes all the way across the country to just outside New York City. And then finally you have the longest interstate, I-90, which starts in Seattle and goes all the way across the northern part of the country to Boston, Massachusetts. In addition to these routes, there are a ton of minor routes. Like I said, in general, they follow the system, although some of them directionally don't make sense. Like I-26, for example, you would think it's an east-west interstate, but really the routing mostly follows a north-south route. But like I said, the interstate system has a ton of in-general statements in front of it. And some of these minor routes can be pretty long. Like for example, I-64 starts west of St. Louis and goes all the way to the Hampton Roads metro area in Virginia, which is basically the coast of Virginia. Some of these interstates, though, are pretty short. The shortest interstate you have is I-97 in Maryland, which basically just connects Annapolis to Baltimore. And really, I think it personally should be a spur route. Speaking of spur routes, let's talk a little bit more about those. So you have the major two-digit interstates that we were just talking about. However, a ton of these interstates have what are known as auxiliary routes. And as I mentioned, a spur route is one of those routes, but you also have belts and loops. So if you ever seen an interstate with 3 digits, that's an auxiliary route, and there is a code behind it. So the first number in general is going to tell you what kind of interstate it is. In general, spur routes are an odd number, while belts and loops are an even number. And then the second and third numbers are just the numbers of the parent interstate. So basically, spur routes branch off of a parent interstate and they don't connect back to that interstate. So a good example of this is I-385 in Greenville, South Carolina. Basically, it starts in Greenville and it goes all the way down to Lawrence, South Carolina at I-26. It's basically meant to take people from Greenville to Columbia directly. Then we have belts, which is just a partial loop around a city. A good example of this kind of interstate would be I-459 in Birmingham, which starts at I-20 and I-59 in the northern part of the metro, and then kind of goes sort of east and south of the city, and then rejoins I-20 and I-59 at the other end of the metro. And why did I say I-20 and I-59? This is what's known as a concurrency in the interstate system. So a lot of times, 2 or even 3 interstates occasionally can go on the same routing. And like I said, this is what's known as a concurrency. So an example of this would be I-20 coming from the west from Atlanta, and then I-59 coming from the south from Chattanooga, joining up in the Birmingham metro area to go concurrently until they split again after Meridian, Mississippi. So it's a pretty long concurrency. And then finally, let's talk about loops. So loops basically just go around an entire city. And a few good examples of loops are I-285 in Atlanta, I-295 in Jacksonville, Florida, and I-485 in Charlotte, North Carolina. That's the basics about the interstate highway system. There's a ton of videos that I can make about the interstate highway system in the future that I probably will make for content. So stay tuned for those videos. I also like to do travel vlogs on this channel, and pretty soon I'm going to Montreal. So I'm going to be vlogging that. I'll be making shorts as well as a long form vlog. So like and subscribe to make sure that you don't miss the upload whenever that comes out. And I'll see you guys in the next video.